Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to use a couple of podcasts or YouTube videos that I saw over the last day or so as sort of a jumping off point for a conversation. And so both of them come from the Daily Wire. One of them is the Andrew Klavan show. He had a show today, episode 724, on what day is it today? Monday, July 1st, called Leftist Hate Unleashed. And in that conversation, he describes the United States as being split between two different groups. And the way he splits them up is one group being the sort of quote-unquote conservatives, and he's defining that group as people who venerate the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, believe in the original founding idea of small, limited government that is in place to preserve individual freedom and the right to pursue your own happiness. And the other group being, I guess, those on the left are liberals, and he's basically describing them as wanting to sort of use the government as an authoritarian, controlling sort of force. And to a large degree, I agree with him. And I want to take it a little further than that. And so I'm also going to weave in a conversation that Ben Shapiro had, and which was with David Barton on his Sunday shows, or his Sunday special, episode 57, published on June 30th. And in that, David Barton, who's with a group called the Wall Builders, which is a little bit unfortunately named, I guess. It has nothing to do with building the wall, is my point. They are seemingly a group of people who are sort of committed to what Andrew Klavan describes as conservatives. They are committed to the founding of the country. They have a large collection of original documents from the founders, from the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and in the conversation, David Barton describes how the original founders had a very specific idea around, or I guess underpinning, why they believed a small government made sense and would work. And the idea being that they believed that the country was sort of founded on Judeo-Christian principles, that the people in the country believed in those principles, and that the nation would be essentially run on them, and that the schools would teach them, which was news to me. But he, creates or shares several references and original court rulings and things along those lines that basically say that, the original intent of the separation of church and state was not that there wouldn't be religion in schools. Actually, they expected religion in schools. They just didn't want the government to be enforcing which version of religion was taught. The expectation was it would be Bible-based, but that, whether it was Judaism, whether it was one or another versions of Christianity, they didn't care, so long as the fundamentals of the Ten Commandments, the basics of the religion were imparted to children in the country, and that would create a shared foundation for allowing people to live their lives freely, because the expectation was everybody would live within certain already set bounds, and then you would have the government that basically was there to, address major violations of those bounds. So someone who was stealing, someone who was committing murder, someone who was attacking someone physically. But beyond that, in terms of how you went about your day-to-day life, the government was going to stay out of those things. And so I think that the current government takes a very similar view, except that the government is stepping in to do all of those things. And so I want to actually argue that the current form of our government is actually a church. It is actually a religion. And I know many people have talked about sort of leftism as a philosophy being similar to a religion, having a set of dogmas and having, sort of behaviors that you're expected to follow. But I think that in the sort of current version of our government is actually functioning like a church. It is actually taking that dogma, it's taking those rules of morality, and it is both enforcing them, it is teaching them through the schools, it is, doing all of the work that the founders expected churches and people in their homes and sort of privately run schools to actually do. And so now we have a single dogma, which is exactly what the separation of church and state was trying to avoid. A single dogma that is embedded into the church/government and being forced on everybody. And it is sort of creeped out into private institutions like YouTube and Twitter and others, where people are being, as has been talked about ad nauseum, being deplatformed and being silenced and censored and all of those things. But you have the government backing it up. You have the government doing the opposite of what it was intended to do, which was to protect individual liberty, with the expectation that people shared a morality. And now it is using its power and supporting private institutions acting basically illegally to enforce that dogma. And when I say private institutions acting illegally, what I mean is that you have, and this is something that Bill Whittle and people on his channel have described in really great detail, but they are, you have a company like Google, a company like Twitter that are saying that they are not a publisher. They are more like the telephone line or some kind of utility. And so they are just allowing people to share messages through their platform, but they're not in any way editorializing or controlling what that message is. And therefore, they're not legally responsible for what is being shared on their platform. But now, they are actually editorializing. They are actually controlling what that message is, and what you're allowed to say. And so they become a publisher. But right now they are not held to the standard of a publisher. You can't sue them for content that is included on their platform. You have to sue the actual person who posted it. And so it protects them significantly. And that is the government sort of allowing that to be the case and not protecting people's individual liberty. So you have the government sort of complicit in that. And I would say that they are acting in sort of concert with them. And so you have what is essentially like a 15th century religious institution. You have these stories of what the church was like, and where they had their own army, and they had, people sort of out in the parishes that were enforcing whatever rules they wanted to enforce, and forcing people to tithe. And so instead of that, you have taxes, and you have forced schooling for children, and the government gets to regulate if they allow you to homeschool. If you do homeschool, then you have to meet whatever requirements the government sets, and you have to follow all of their rules, and there is no escape beyond the power of the church slash government. So we have gone back to the exact thing, it seems, that we came to this continent to escape. That people, actively risked their lives and left their home country in order to be able to, quote unquote, practice their religion, but to live their lives the way that they saw fit without the control of the church and the government there. And now we are back to this sort of monolithic institution that controls everything, that sets what is moral and immoral. And not only that, they get to change it pretty much whenever they feel like it. If you look at what Bill Clinton ran on as a platform in the 1990s, it wouldn't be anywhere near acceptable in the Democratic Party today. And so, there are vast changes in what's sort of deemed good and not good, and moral and immoral. And all of that is then enforced through the government through a variety of business regulations, all kinds of rules that, banks have to abide by. Any realtors or construction companies have to abide by. There are a million rules that people have to follow that are set by the government and subject to change whenever the government feels like it. And it seems pretty insane at the moment. And you have people on the quote-unquote conservative side who are now simply trying to reestablish the right for people to live as they see fit and not to have a set of moral rules beyond what everybody generally agrees on. Things like not murdering anyone and not physically attacking anybody and not stealing from people. And now it's become what words you can say, what pronouns you can use, what pretty much anything at this point can be regulated through this giant church that we call the government. So curious to hear what people think. I'd love to hear comments about how people think we might be able to change the situation. I am personally struggling to come up with some path that I can foresee that would allow us to go back to a much more limited government. I think that you have large swaths of the population that don't have a faith, that they don't have a sort of traditional religious practice or religious belief. And so they have sort of become followers of this, secular church. And you also have a large number of traditional churches that seem to have joined in or ceded their authority in some ways. It's a little, that piece is kind of baffling for me. There seems to have been a major shift in religious thought, at least in this country, whereby churches no longer believe that you should take personal responsibility for your actions, that, brothers and sisters within the church, while they can call each other out on things that they see somebody doing that is harmful to themselves or others, which has sort of a history back in the Bibles and Paul's letters, and sort of a tradition there. But at the end of the day, the individual was responsible for their own actions and answered to God. And so now we have God residing in the government, and many of these churches basically agreeing that the government should now be the enforcer. The government should now prevent you from doing something that they believe you shouldn't be doing, and essentially taking the place of God, which is mind-blowing to me. It's this sort of the opposite of humility is a level of arrogance that people think not only can they discern what is okay or not okay, but that they should be taking the place of God and using physical violence or the threat of physical violence to enforce those rules. When all you have to do is look at the world today and you can recognize that God does not do the same. God gives us an incredible amount of freedom and works with us if you are open to it, in my experience, to change things that you want to change, to succeed in things that you want to succeed in. It's not perfect because there are millions of other people and we all interact with each other. And so it's not a scenario where God will just force someone else to do something so that you get what you want. But that actually sort of proved my point. God does not intervene that way in my experience. God will help you get what you want where it does not impede on someone else. And so, this piece of the churches sort of colluding with a bigger centralized church in order to enforce morality on people seems to be a huge, huge, huge step back to before the founding of the country and back to the authoritarianism that Andrew Clavin was describing. So again, would love to hear people's thoughts on how we get away from that. I've spoken in other videos or podcasts about needing to get to a point where we can separate. We can find a way to either shrink the size of the federal government and allow local or state governments to impose the rules that people in that locality agree upon. So if you wanted to have sort of a version of what we have in the federal government today in California, and all of those rules would apply, and everybody there agrees that that's the best way to go about it, then I have no problem with that. And I think most quote unquote conservatives would be fine with that. It's this imposing it on the rest of the country when we have this major split that seems to be creating a lot of tension and a potential for violence. And I would love to find a way to avoid that. So I think I'll end it here. Welcome your feedback and your comments, and we'll speak to you again soon.